Welcome to Life Stories, where today you'll meet a woman who lost everything: her partner, her home, even her name, but still found the strength to fight for something no one else believed she deserved. What would you do if the person you loved most left you protection in secret, and the only thing standing in your way was the person who shared his blood? This isn't just a story about grief or betrayal. It's about reclaiming dignity when the world calls you disposable, and finding the courage to begin again at the very moment life tells you it's too late. Stay with us. What happens next will break your heart and rebuild it. Now let me take you back to the day everything changed for Eleanor West. The first time Eleanor West truly felt retired was the moment she realized she had nowhere to be. Not the quiet Saturday mornings or the long lunches with book club friends, not the Pilates classes or the endless newsletters from the HOA, but that Tuesday afternoon, standing in her Charleston kitchen, watching the kettle scream for someone who no longer existed. That was the moment. Outside, the southern sky hung low with storm clouds, the kind that threatened more than rain. Inside, everything was clean. Too clean. The walls still bore the pale yellow paint Samuel had insisted on, cheerful without being loud, but they had grown dim without his voice echoing off them. His coffee mug, chipped and blue, still sat by the sink, like it was waiting for a refill that would never come. Eleanor wrapped her cardigan tighter. She had built an entire life around efficiency. Years as a project manager for one of the largest logistics firms in the Southeast. Order was her defense, planning her weapon. But no spreadsheet had ever prepared her for the silence. 3 months. That's how long it had been since Samuel Carter's heart gave out in the middle of their Sunday crossword. 3 months since his son, Ethan, showed up at the funeral and cried crocodile tears into a pressed linen handkerchief, only to show up at the house 2 days later with a lawyer and a locksmith. And 3 months since Eleanor found herself sleeping in the guest bedroom of a house she hadn't entered in 15 years. Her old house, her backup plan, her exile. She hadn't told anyone about the trust. Mostly because she didn't know about it herself. Not until the bank teller looked at her passbook, blinked, and called over a manager. $257,000, deposited quarterly, under her name. From a living trust established by Samuel Carter. He had never told her. Not once. And now, weeks later, the discovery sat in her chest like a puzzle missing its final piece. Why had he hidden it? Why hadn't he fought for her in life if he was willing to protect her in death? A clap of thunder rattled the windows. Eleanor flinched, nearly dropping the tea kettle. She turned off the stove and carried the steaming cup to her armchair, the only one that didn't creak. Rain streaked across the window pane like trembling fingers. Somewhere deep in her gut, something stirred. Not grief, not yet anger, but an ache of unfinished business. She picked up the letter again. The handwriting was unmistakable. Samuel's all-caps scrawl that leaned too far right and left ink smudges on everything. If you're reading this, Elle, it means I'm already gone. And I'm sorry. Sorry I never said it aloud. You were always more than a companion. You were my second beginning. This trust, it's not payment, it's protection. I know my son. I know what he's capable of. He won't understand. Maybe he won't forgive. But I couldn't leave you with nothing. It was dated 3 years ago, signed, notarized. But the final page was strange. The signature smudged, red-stamped with two chilling words, revoked pending review. That's what had sent Eleanor spiraling back into the world she thought she'd left behind. Meetings, documents, appointments, and finally, Grace Montgomery, a retired attorney with a spine like steel and lipstick that never smudged. Together, they'd uncovered enough to suggest foul play. Ethan had filed for the trust to be frozen, citing Samuel's supposed cognitive decline. He'd even provided psychiatric records, records from doctors Eleanor had never met, from clinics Samuel had never mentioned. And most damning, the revocation had been filed only weeks before his death. While Samuel was still fixing leaky sinks and remembering exact crossword clues from 1998. "I've seen this before," Grace had said, fingers drumming on the manila folder. medical fraud, signature forgery. Sons like Ethan think the absence of a marriage certificate gives them a blank check. But it was never about the money, Eleanor said, barely above a whisper. Grace had paused. Then make it about something else. Dignity, truth, closure, whatever it takes to sleep through the night. And maybe Eleanor could have stopped there. Let the money go. Let Ethan win. She'd survived worse. But then came the letter. Not Samuel's, Ethan's. A single line, delivered through a firm, cold, arrogant. Per Clause 3A of South Carolina inheritance law, the house at 32 Magnolia Lane is now under my ownership. You have 10 days to vacate. Her hands had trembled as she read it, not because of the loss, but because of the memory. That house was where she and Samuel had danced barefoot in the kitchen, where they had listened to jazz on lazy Sunday mornings and planted rosemary on the porch. It wasn't just brick and wood. It was proof that something real had happened, that despite the lack of rings and paperwork, she had been chosen, loved. She set the teacup down with a sharp clink. No, she wasn't going to let Ethan rewrite her story. Not while her name was still printed in ink on that trust. Not while the memory of Samuel's laugh still echoed in her hallway. The next morning, Eleanor, dressed in her old navy raincoat, the one Samuel used to tease, made her look like a detective. She pulled her hair into a loose bun, slipped a flash drive into her pocket, and headed to Grace's office. But as she stepped outside, her breath caught. Parked across the street was a dark silver SUV, Ethan's. And inside, slouched in the driver's seat watching her, Ethan Carter. She hadn't seen him in weeks, not since the court ordered the temporary freeze on all trust-related claims. He was supposed to be out of town, working, or so she thought. Eleanor's heart hammered as she turned to walk, but her phone buzzed, unknown number. She answered, hand shaking. A male voice, calm and low. Miss West, this is Barrett Law Firm. We've received a request to release the video footage from the original trust signing. But there's a problem. What kind of problem, she asked. A beat of silence. Then, the footage is missing. It was requested for private viewing 2 months ago. Signed for by Ethan Carter. Eleanor's legs weakened beneath her. She reached out to the porch railing for balance. That was the moment. The moment she realized this wasn't about grief or misunderstanding. It was a takedown. Carefully calculated. Ruthlessly executed. Samuel hadn't underestimated Ethan. He had seen this coming, but even he didn't know how far his son would go. What would you do if someone tried to erase your entire love story from the record? Have you ever discovered a secret too devastating to ignore? The storm outside was nothing compared to the one Eleanor was about to unleash. To be continued. Eleanor stood frozen on the porch, the morning air thick with humidity and something darker. Betrayal. Her fingers curled tighter around the phone as the voice from Barrett Law faded into a dial tone. The footage was gone. Signed out by Ethan. And now he was parked across the street, watching her house like a predator waiting for weakness. She took a deep breath and exhaled through her nose, slow and steady, like Grace had taught her in court prep. Panic never solved anything. She turned and went back inside, locking the door behind her. Then she pulled the blinds halfway down and let the kettle boil without pouring a cup. Footage can be lost. Evidence can be faked. But people remember. Witnesses, if they're willing, don't vanish so easily. She dug through the file Grace had given her weeks ago, flipping past bank records and signed affidavits until she found it, a scribbled note in Samuel's handwriting. Barrett's guy said it's fine as long as I have a witness. George came with me? That counts, right? George. Samuel's oldest friend. A gruff old engineer who used to stop by on Saturdays, track mud through her kitchen, and fix her screen doors without being asked. She hadn't seen him since the funeral. Eleanor pulled on her boots and grabbed her keys. If Ethan thought he could win this by erasing the past, she'd remind him some things don't fade just because you look away. George Jennings lived in a part of Charleston that had escaped the slow march of gentrification. The paint peeled from porches, the sidewalks were cracked, but there was a quiet dignity in the way the curtains still moved behind windows and planters sat full of stubborn marigolds. Eleanor knocked. No answer. She tried again. The door opened a sliver. George stood behind it, thinner than she remembered, his once straight frame bowed by time. Eleanor? His voice rasped like dry leaves. She offered a weak smile. I need your help. He didn't open the door farther. I don't get involved. You already are, she said softly, holding up the note. Samuel wrote your name down, said you were with him. That makes you a witness. George's eyes flicked to the paper. Something passed across his face. Regret? Or maybe guilt. That was years ago. My memory's not what it used to be. But it was that day, she pressed. You were there when he signed the trust. You saw him. You know he wasn't impaired. George opened the door a few more inches, but didn't let her in. Do you know who came to see me last week? Ethan. Told me his father was slipping before the end. Said you were manipulating him. Offered to pay for some work I need done around the house, if I stayed out of it. Eleanor's stomach twisted. And did you take it? I didn't say yes, he said gruffly, but I didn't say no either. She looked him dead in the eye. You knew Sam better than anyone. You know he wouldn't have let someone make decisions for him. If you stay silent, you're letting Ethan rewrite everything Samuel did to protect me. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he shut the door. Eleanor stood there for several seconds, staring at the faded welcome mat. The air buzzed with the sound of cicadas and betrayal. She turned and walked back to her car, each step heavier than the last. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her armchair with the letter in her lap, rereading the same lines until they blurred. This trust, it's not payment, it's protection. How do you protect someone who no longer wants to be saved? A soft knock came at the door just before dawn. She opened it to find George, dressed in an old plaid coat, holding a folder. I lied, he said before she could speak. I remember everything. I was there. He wasn't confused. He made every decision with his damn hands steady and his voice clear. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Then testify. George nodded. I'll say what needs to be said. But you need to understand something, Eleanor. If Ethan's willing to manipulate records, bribe witnesses, he won't stop just because I speak up. I know, she said quietly, but neither will I. The next morning, Grace filed an emergency petition to submit new testimony. But the storm wasn't over. That afternoon, a courier arrived with a thick envelope addressed to Eleanor. No return name. Inside were copies of psychiatric reports, affidavits from neighbors who claimed she isolated Samuel, and a photo of her, blurry, grainy, leaving Barrett Law with a flash drive in hand. There was a typed note on crisp paper. Withdraw your claim or this goes public. You won't just lose the trust, you'll lose your name. It wasn't signed, but it didn't have to be. Eleanor dropped the papers onto the counter like they were venomous. Her hands shook, but her spine stayed straight. If this was Ethan's game, he'd just made one fatal mistake. He'd tried to make her afraid. And Eleanor West had already lived through worse than fear. What would you do if someone threatened your truth to silence your voice? Do you believe standing your ground is worth the risk, even if the world doubts you? As Eleanor turned to face the mirror, she didn't see a widow. She saw a witness, and a reckoning was coming. It was the silence in the courtroom that struck Eleanor first. Not the silence of respect or stillness, but that charged, aching quiet that falls when people are holding their breath, waiting for something to break. George sat at the witness stand, his worn coat folded neatly on his lap, hands trembling just slightly as he leaned toward the microphone. Samuel Carter was not confused, not fading, not manipulated, he said, voice gravelly but sure. He read every page twice. He asked questions I didn't even think to ask. He was protecting someone. I remember him turning to me and saying, I don't care what Ethan thinks. She's the only one who's ever stayed. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ethan sat across the room, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched. His lawyer whispered something into his ear, but he didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, unmoving. Grace followed with a blistering closing argument, laying out the timeline, the inconsistencies, and finally, the threat Eleanor had received. Though unsigned, it was enough to raise suspicion. enough for the judge to consider intent. When the final gavel struck, it felt more like thunder than wood on wood. "The trust shall stand," the judge declared. "All property and financial assets therein remain with the named beneficiary, Miss Eleanor West. Furthermore, this court will be opening a formal inquiry into allegations of forgery and witness tampering against Mr. Ethan Carter." The courtroom erupted, in gasps, in shuffling, in the slow exhale of people who hadn't realized they were holding their breath. But Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't even move. She sat still, her fingers resting against the edge of the table, as if bracing for the ground beneath her to shift again. Because the truth is, victory doesn't always feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like grief finally arriving with a face you can't look away from. Outside the courthouse, reporters tried to catch her for comments, but Grace held up a hand, shielding Eleanor like a mother wolf. They slipped into the car, doors shut like armor. No one spoke until they'd cleared 3 intersections and the last camera was out of sight. Eleanor looked out the window. "He would have hated all this," she murmured. Grace glanced at her. "Then why fight for it?" "Because it mattered to me," she whispered. "Because no one else was going to." Weeks passed. The trust was reinstated. The house was returned. The bank released the final letter Samuel had written. This one sealed, intended for delivery only if Eleanor chose to accept the trust. She didn't open it right away. She left it on the mantel, next to a photo of them laughing in the kitchen, him holding up a burnt pot roast like a trophy, her mid-laugh, blurry but radiant. That was the version of them she wanted to keep. Not this courtroom chapter, not the battle scars. But life, as it always does, moved forward. Golden Second Chance reopened. The calls resumed. Clients returned. And then one afternoon, Eleanor found a man sitting quietly in the community center's waiting area, slouched, gray around the edges, older than his years. Ethan. He didn't speak at first. Just looked up, a flicker of shame in his eyes, then down again like the weight of his own name was too much to carry. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said quietly. She didn't answer. He shifted in the chair, awkward. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just, I don't know, maybe to understand." She sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "You tried to erase me." He nodded. "I know. You threatened me." Another nod, slower this time. I still remember the day your father brought home that umbrella. He said, 'Met someone today who doesn't mind silence. That's rare.'" Ethan swallowed. "I didn't know how to handle him choosing someone else. I thought, maybe if I took everything back, I could undo it." "You can't undo love," she said. "You can only dishonor it." There was a pause. Then Ethan said something she didn't expect. "They laid me off. No one returns my calls. Even my kid won't speak to me." Eleanor looked at him, at the man who had once held power over her, who had stolen her home, tried to strip her name from memory. He looked so small now, so undone. "I'm not going to save you," she said. He didn't argue. "But there's a room downstairs," she added, almost absently. "It's not comfortable, and you'll pull your weight." He looked up, eyes brimming but dry. "Why would you let me stay?" "Because I'm not you," she said. He stayed for 3 months. He cooked, cleaned, spoke little. Apologized once, late at night, over dishes, not with words, but with a look so naked in its regret she couldn't bear to meet it. Then one morning he was gone. No note, no goodbye, just a folded blanket and a vase of fresh rosemary on the table. Eleanor stood there a long time, her hand resting on the back of his now empty chair. Sometimes people leave, and it's a wound. Sometimes it's healing. She turned to the mantel, picked up the envelope, opened it. Inside was a short letter in Samuel's signature scrawl. "Elle, you'll never need my protection. You've always been stronger than me. But if this helps you sleep, take it. This isn't goodbye. Just a reminder that love, real love, doesn't disappear. It lives in the hands you hold, the meals you share, the fights worth having. I didn't leave you anything. I just left you space to begin again." Her fingers trembled. And then finally, she cried. Not because she was broken, but because she had made it through. Because beginning again wasn't just possible. She had already done it. What did this story make you feel, and which moment stayed with you the longest? If you loved this story, Comment 100 to let us know. Tell us where you're watching from, what country, what city. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real. Thank you for watching Life Stories.